The land breathed in shallow, golden breaths, Montana territory. In the last days of autumn, 1886 was a study in patience. The great sea of grass had cured to the color of old honey, and it whispered a dry, rustling secret to anyone who'd listen. The wind, coming down from the distant, toothy peaks of the bridgers, was not a hammer but a set of cold, invisible fingers, combing through the brittle stems, searching for something it had lost last summer. It was a lonely sound, the sound of a season packing its belongings, preparing to leave the world to the quiet and the snow. The ranch was hunkered down in a wide valley, a collection of sturdy, unpainted buildings that had surrendered to the color of the earth and sky-gray wood, dark soil, and the pale, washed-out blue above. The main house stood solid, a two-story declaration against the emptiness, but the heart of the place, its truest warmth, beat in a smaller building set behind it, the cookhouse. From the outside, it was little more than a shed, its timber walls chapped by sun and frost. A stone chimney, squat and resolute, exhaled a lazy ribbon of pale smoke that the wind immediately seized and tore to shreds. But inside, the world was small, warm, and alive. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of melting butter, the sharp tang of burning pine, and the comforting, dusty perfume of flour. A massive cast-iron stove, the black heart of the room, dominated one wall. It wasn't merely hot, it was a living creature, sighing with heat, its iron belly rumbling with a contained fire. Its surface was a map of past meals, marked by the ghosts of spilled stews and spatters of grease, polished to a dull sheen by 1,000 dutiful rags. In the center of the room stood a wooden table, its surface a geography of labor. It was not smooth. It was a landscape of knife cuts, faint circles where hot pots had rested, and a gentle dip in the center where years of kneading and chopping had worn the pine away. To touch it was to feel the grain, to feel the history of every loaf, every pie, every meal that had sustained the men who worked this vast, demanding land. At this table stood Evelyn Ward. She was 25, though the seriousness in her posture could make her seem older. Her life had been drawn with simple, hard lines. She was the daughter of a family that had possessed more hope than money, a hope that had frayed and worn thin like an old coat. Her schooling had ended when she was tall enough to be useful, her world shrinking to the dimensions of kitchens and pantries. But within that small world, her hands had found their own education. They were clever, knowing hands, strong from lifting cast iron and gentle from coaxing life into dough. Right now, they were working a mound of pale, elastic dough, pushing and folding, turning and pressing, in a rhythm as old as bread itself. Flour, fine as dust, coated her wrists and forearms, a pale stocking that ended where her rolled-up sleeves began. Her dress was simple, a dark calico worn soft with washing, and her brown hair was pulled back from her face in a severe knot that allowed no stray strands to escape. There was nothing remarkable about the picture, nothing a passing glance would hold on to. It was a scene of domestic work, repeated daily across the territory, except for the sound. As her hands worked, a sound rose from her, soft and low. It was not singing, not quite. It was humming, a thread of melody woven into the quiet industry of the room. It was a tune her mother had taught her, an old folk song from a place she'd never seen, with words she only half remembered. The melody was all that mattered. It was a simple, looping tune, full of a gentle melancholy that asked for nothing. It was a sound made for oneself, as natural and unconscious as breathing. It filled the warm, thick air, mingling with the sizzle of butter browning in a pan on the stove. The scent and the sound became one thing, a low, steady pulse, as even and as vital as a human heartbeat keeping time for the whole, lonely ranch. Outside, the world was one of movement and purpose. Graham Thatcher was riding back from the north pasture, his horse, a big roan, picking its way carefully around the back of the stables. Graham was the owner of this land, a man who had inherited its burdens and its beauty in equal measure. He was not a man given to idleness or distraction. His focus was always on the next task, the leaking roof on the bunkhouse, the price of cattle in Bozeman, the threat of an early winter. His mind was a ledger of numbers, needs, and worries. He was passing the cookhouse, his thoughts already on the evening meal and the reports from his foreman, when the sound reached him. It was faint at first, a thin strand of music against the constant whisper of the wind. He might have dismissed it, might have thought it was the wind itself whistling through a crack in the stable wall. But it was steady, it had shape, it was human. Without conscious thought, his hand tightened on the reins, the roan, sensitive to the slightest shift in its rider, slowed and then stopped. Graham sat motionless in the saddle, head tilted, listening. The sound was clearer now, a woman's hum, low and pure. It wasn't a performance, it was too private for that. It was the sound of someone so lost in their work that their soul had begun to speak in a language of its own. He swung down from the saddle, his boots making a soft thud on the damp, cold earth. He moved quietly, his steps measured, looping the reins over a low fence post. He walked not toward the door of the cookhouse, but toward the side, where a single window looked out onto the empty space between the kitchen and the barn. The window was propped open just a crack, enough to let the steam escape, and enough to let the sound out. Graham stopped a few feet from the wall. He was a tall man, and his shadow fell long and thin in the late afternoon light. He leaned his shoulder against the rough timber of the building, careful to stay out of sight of the window. He did not want to look in. To look would be to intrude, to make the private sound a public spectacle. It felt more honest to simply receive it, to let it wash over him without the complication of sight. He pushed his hands deep into the pockets of his heavy wool coat, the rough fabric of familiar comfort. He closed his eyes and just listened. He could hear the crackle of the fire inside, a sound he knew well. He could smell the browning butter and the yeast, but it was the humming that held him. In a world defined by the harsh sounds of labor, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the bawling of cattle, the shouts of men, this sound was different. It was soft. It was whole. It spoke of a peace he rarely encountered. He didn't recognize the tune, but it felt ancient, like a lullaby for a weary world. It rose and fell with the rhythm of the kneading he could only imagine, a steady, unbroken thread of quiet contentment. He stood there for a long time, a statue carved from silence, while the simple, unadorned music remade the world around him. Inside, Evelyn's hands came to a stop. The dough was ready, smooth and alive under her palms. As her hands stilled, so did her voice. The melody hung in the air for a moment and then dissolved. The final line of the song, the only words she always remembered clearly, echoed in her mind. If the sun forgets to rise. The silence that followed was immense. It rushed in to fill the space the music had occupied, and it felt heavier, more profound than the silence that had come before. The only sounds now were the hiss of the stove and the distant moan of the wind. It was a silence that felt like a held breath, like the quiet after a confession. Evelyn shaped the dough into a loaf, placed it in a greased tin, and covered it with a clean cloth, setting it near the stove to rise. But a strange feeling pricked at the back of her neck. It was a feeling of being watched, or rather, of having been listened to. The air in the kitchen felt different, subtly charged. She was sure she had been alone. She was always alone. Yet, the feeling persisted, a quiet but insistent hum in her own senses. She wiped her floured hands on her apron, her movements slow, thoughtful. She walked to the heavy wooden door and hesitated for a second, her hand on the iron latch. It was foolish. There was no one out there. It was just the wind and the coming twilight. Still, she had to look. She lifted the latch and pulled the door inward. The cold air rushed to meet her, smelling of dust and frost. She stepped onto the single wooden step and looked out. The yard was empty. The long shadows of the barn and the main house were stretching across the hard-packed dirt. The wind swirled a few dry leaves in a lazy circle. Nothing. Just the end of another day. She chided herself for her foolishness, for letting the loneliness of the season creep into her imagination. But as she was about to turn back inside, her eyes caught something. There, in the damp, soft earth just beside the path, was a single, perfect hoof print. It was fresh. The edges were still sharp, not yet softened by the wind. It was the mark of a large horse, shod and well cared for. It was the only mark. One hoof print, as if a horse and rider had stood there, stock still, for some time, and then vanished. Her gaze followed the line from the hoof print to the wooden step where she stood, and there, placed neatly in the center of the worn board, was a small, folded piece of paper. It wasn't a scrap. It was clean, torn carefully from what might have been a ledger or a journal. Her heart gave a sudden, hard thump against her ribs. She looked around the yard again, her eyes scanning the corners of the buildings, the shadows, the long line of the fence. Nothing. She was completely alone. With a trembling hand, she bent down and picked up the paper. It was cool to the touch. She unfolded it. Inside, written in a strong, clear hand, were 7 simple words. I didn't know kitchens could sing. Evelyn read the words once, then twice. They seemed to hum on the page, a faint echo of the song she'd just been humming. A flush of heat crept up her neck and spread across her cheeks. It was a complex feeling, part embarrassment, part confusion, part a strange, unfamiliar warmth that settled deep in her chest. Someone had heard her. Someone had stood right outside, in the cold, and listened to her private, foolish humming. And they had not mocked it. They had named it. She quickly stepped back inside, closing the door and bolting it, a gesture of pure, unthinking instinct. She leaned against the solid wood, the small piece of paper clutched in her hand. The kitchen, which had felt so safe and familiar just moments before, now felt like a stage. She looked at the stove, the table, the flour sack in the corner, seeing them all through new eyes. This space was not just hers anymore. A piece of the outside world had found its way in. Later that evening, long after the men had eaten their meal in the main house and she had cleaned away the last of the dishes, she sat at the rough wooden table by the light of a single kerosene lamp. She took out her mother's old recipe book. Its cover was stained and softened with age, its pages filled with her mother's spidery handwriting and, more recently, her own clearer script. It was the book of her trade, the most valuable thing she owned. She opened it to a page near the back, a blank page she had been saving. Carefully, she placed the small note with its 7 words onto the page. For a moment she thought of pasting it in, but that felt too permanent, too bold. Instead, she simply closed the book on it, letting the weight of the pages press it flat, hiding it between a recipe for apple pie and one for sourdough starter. She would not speak of it. She would not ask about it. To do so would be to break the spell, to let the common, harsh light of day fall upon something delicate and strange. The note was a secret. It was a mystery she had no intention of solving. She would keep it, hidden and silent, like a single, live coal saved from a fire, wrapped in ash to keep its warmth from dying out. The day after, the silence in the kitchen felt different. It was no longer a simple absence of sound. It was a vessel, a container for the memory of a single, soft melody and 7 written words. Evelyn moved through her morning chores with a new, heightened awareness. The scrape of the ladle against the bottom of the stew pot seemed louder, the thud of the cleaver on the chopping block more decisive. She felt as though she were moving under a microscope, though she knew the feeling was born of her own mind. When she stepped out to fetch water from the pump, her eyes went immediately, involuntarily, to the spot in the damp earth. The hoof print from yesterday was still there, softened and blurred by the night's frost, but another was beside it. Sharper, deeper. He had been back. She felt a jolt, a current of something warm and unsettling that ran from her stomach to her fingertips. There was no note this time. There was nothing at all. Just the silent testimony of a horse that had stood and waited. She worked through the day in a state of quiet agitation. Should she hum if she did? Was it an invitation? If she didn't, was it a rejection? The simple, unconscious act had become a decision, freighted with a weight she didn't understand. She kneaded the day's bread in a tense silence, her hands pushing and pulling the dough with a ferocity that was usually reserved for scrubbing the most stubborn pots. The kitchen was just a kitchen again, a place of work, filled with the familiar smells of yeast and smoke. But it felt diminished, as if a color had been drained from the air. The next day, the hoofprint was there again, and the day after that, it became a part of her morning ritual to open the door, to feel the bite of the cold air, and to let her gaze fall upon that single, silent mark. It was a greeting without a voice, a presence without a body, a quiet, persistent question that she had no answer for. Then, on the fourth morning, there was something else. Resting on the top step, precisely in the middle, was a single flower. It was a mountain daisy, its petals a shade of deep, startling purple, its center a bright, hopeful yellow. It was small and perfect, and utterly out of place. These flowers didn't grow down here in the valley, where the grass was thick and the soil was rich. They belonged high up, in the rocky, wind-swept places where only the hardiest things survived. To find it here meant someone had ridden up into the high country, had seen this one small spot of color, and had carried it carefully all the way back down. Evelyn picked it up. The stem was still cool and damp with mountain dew. The petals were soft as moth wings against her calloused fingertips. She looked at the fresh hoofprint in the dirt, then back at the flower. This was a gift that had required effort. It spoke of a long ride, of a deliberate search. She took the flower inside and placed it in a small tin cup of water, setting it on the windowsill. Its bright color was a defiant splash against the gray, weathered wood of the kitchen walls. It was a secret she could look at, a piece of the high mountains brought down just for her. That afternoon, she hummed. It was tentative at first, a melody as fragile as the daisy's petals, but as she worked, as she lost herself in the rhythm of chopping vegetables and stirring the pot, the tune grew stronger, more certain. She was not singing for an audience. She was singing for the flower. She was answering its silent, purple declaration with one of her own. The silent gifts continued. They were never predictable, and they were always practical. One morning, she came out to find a neat stack of kindling beside the door. The pine split fine and small, smelling sharply of resin. It was perfectly dry, meaning it hadn't been gathered that morning but had been cut and seasoned, stored somewhere with care. It was enough for a week of easy fire starting. She accepted it as she had the flower, with a quiet nod to the empty yard. A few days later, the hinge on the large pantry cabinet, a thing that had shrieked and groaned like a dying animal for as long as she could remember, fell silent. She opened it, expecting the familiar complaint, but it swung inward with a smooth, oiled whisper. She looked closer and saw a small, expertly placed leather shim wedged tightly into the joint. She ran her finger over it. It was a simple fix, an act of 5 minutes for someone with the right tool and the knowledge. But it was 5 minutes that someone had taken to notice a small, daily annoyance of hers and to erase it. Evelyn found herself caught in a strange new rhythm. She was waiting, but she would never have admitted it, not even to the deepest part of her own heart. The word waiting implied an expectation, a hope for something to happen. What she was doing felt different. It was a state of listening, of being attuned to the world in a new way. Her work had always been her entire focus, a series of tasks to be completed. Now, the work was the backdrop for a quiet, unfolding story, She would find a loose board on the porch step nailed firmly back into place. A barrel of flour, too heavy for her to move easily, would appear one morning shifted to a more convenient spot. These were not the gestures of a suitor. There were no ribbons, no poems, no flowery words. They were the actions of a man who knew the language of work, who saw a problem and fixed it. They were the offerings of a pair of hands that knew how to listen. And so, Evelyn sang more often. Her voice was still quiet. A sound meant more for herself than for the world. But it was steadier now. The notes held a little longer. The melodies infused with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. One late afternoon, as the sun was beginning its long, slow slide behind the western mountains, she was inside, wiping down the long wooden table. The air was growing cool, and the light had softened to a gentle, golden glow. Through the window, she heard a sound that didn't belong to the usual evening rhythm of the ranch, the steady, rhythmic tap of a hammer. It was coming from above. Curiosity pulled her to the door. She opened it just a crack and peered out. The sound was coming from the roof of the cookhouse itself. She stepped outside and looked up. There, silhouetted against the pale, evening sky, was Graham Thatcher. He was on his knees, a hammer in his hand, carefully fitting a new wooden shingle into place. He was replacing a plank that had been warped and split by the summer sun and the autumn rains. A spot right over her pantry that had produced a slow, persistent drip every time it rained. She had told no one about it. She had simply learned to place a bucket underneath it. He must have felt her eyes on him. He stopped hammering and looked down. Their gazes met across the 15 feet of cool, still air. His face was unreadable, shadowed by the brim of his hat. He was not a man who smiled easily. His features were carved by the same sun and wind that shaped the land, strong and uncompromising. He looked at her for a long moment, a moment that stretched until it felt as thin and fragile as a spider's thread. Evelyn's heart climbed into her throat. She thought he would speak, that this strange, silent courtship would finally find a voice. She didn't know what she wanted him to say, and the thought terrified her. But he didn't speak. He simply gave her a single, brief nod. It was not a greeting, not exactly. It was an acknowledgement, an admission. Yes, it is me. Yes, I am here. And then he turned back to his work. The sound of the hammer began again. 4 sharp, precise blows driving a nail home. The rhythm was steady, confident, and final. Evelyn retreated back into the kitchen, her cheeks burning. She hadn't been discovered. She had been seen. There was a difference. He had looked at her, and in his gaze, there was no flirtation, no demand, no expectation. There was only a quiet, direct recognition. She felt an odd sense of relief, as if a question she hadn't even known she was asking had been answered. The gifts became a little bolder after that. One evening, she went to sit on the small, rough bench that rested against the outside wall of the kitchen, her one spot for catching the last rays of the sun at the end of a long day. The bench had always been a trial to sit on, its wood warped and splintered by years of weather. But tonight, when she sat, the surface was different. She ran her hand over it. It was smooth, perfectly, impossibly smooth. Someone had taken the time to plane and sand it down, erasing every splinter, every rough edge, until the wood felt like cool, worn silk beneath her palm. He had even placed it directly under the window where he had first heard her sing, the window where her Daisy now sat. She sat on the smooth, comfortable bench and leaned her head back against the warm wall of the kitchen. The air inside her small world had changed. It was no longer just a place of solitude. It was a place of observation, of quiet care. It was the profound and deeply comforting feeling of being seen without being stared at, of being tended to without being possessed. She began to allow herself a small smile, a secret thing she would hide in the steam rising from a fresh loaf of bread, or in the reflection on a polished copper pot. Sometimes, when she was humming one of her mother's old songs, she would hold the final note a little longer, letting it hang in the warm, buttery air like a question. She would stretch the sound out, an invisible hand reaching into the silence, feeling for the comforting, solid presence of an unseen shoulder. As she locked the door that night, she blew out the lamp and stood for a moment in the darkness, the scent of sanded pine still clinging to her clothes. A single, terrifying, and exhilarating question formed in her mind. A question she did not dare to speak aloud, for fear the answer would be one she could not bear. "If I stopped singing, would you still come?" It began, as such things often do, in a place of sweat and leather and male confidence. The whispers started in the stables, a low murmur that coiled around the scent of hay and horsehide. It was a sound that carried on the wind, lighter than a saddle, but heavier than a secret. "See the boss lately?" one of the younger hands, a boy named Silas with more muscle than sense, muttered to an older rancher named Jedediah. "Seems to find a lot of reasons to check the fence line behind the cookhouse." Jedediah, a man whose face was a roadmap of long winters and dry summers, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Ain't the fence he's checking on, it's the music." Silas looked confused. "Music?" "The little cook girl, Evelyn," Jedediah clarified, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial rasp. "Sings like a damn meadowlark when she's making biscuits. Seems all a woman's got to do is hum a few bars and the boss'll come running." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Should have told my wife that years ago." The poison, once spoken, began to seep into the soil of the ranch. It traveled from the stables to the bunkhouse, from the corral to the porch of the main house. It was a currency traded in knowing glances and quiet chuckles. The small, silent gifts that had been Evelyn's private treasure were dragged out into the harsh light of public speculation. The infection reached the main kitchen a few days later. This kitchen was a different world from Evelyn's small cookhouse. It was a place of hierarchy and sharp tongues, presided over by Molly, a stout woman in her 40s with eyes that missed nothing and a mouth that soured everything they saw. Evelyn had come in for a sack of potatoes, her presence always a quiet intrusion into Molly's territory. As she was hoisting the heavy sack, Molly's voice, sharp as a boning knife, cut through the air. "Well, well, look what the cat dragged in." Evelyn didn't turn. She knew the tone. It was the prelude to a sting. "Saw a fresh jar of clover honey on your shelf this morning." "Evelyn," Molly said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. She was wiping down a countertop, but her eyes were fixed on Evelyn's back. "That's the expensive kind, the kind Mr. Thatcher keeps for his personal use." She paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. Funny how it found its way to the cookhouse. Must have flown there on the wings of a song. A younger kitchen maid giggled, then smothered the sound with her hand when Molly shot her a glare. Evelyn stood frozen, the rough burlap of the sack digging into her shoulder. The honey had appeared that morning, a small stone jar with a cork stopper, sitting next to the daisy on her windowsill. It had been a surprise, a small luxury she would never have bought for herself. She had imagined him placing it there in the pre-dawn quiet. Another silent, practical gift. Now, Molly had taken that image and twisted it into something ugly, something transactional. She turned slowly, her face a pale, still mask. She looked at Molly, at the smug, knowing smirk on the woman's face. Evelyn opened her mouth to say something, to defend herself, to explain, but what could she say? "He leaves me things because I hum." The words sounded foolish even in her own mind. They sounded exactly like the accusation Molly was making. So she said nothing. She hoisted the sack higher onto her shoulder, turned her back on Molly's triumphant sneer, and walked out. The heavy kitchen door swung shut behind her, but it couldn't block out the sound of the maid's renewed, bolder laughter. The walk back to her cookhouse felt a mile long. The world, which had seemed to be quietly unfolding with a secret and beautiful logic, had suddenly turned on her. The air was full of eyes. As she passed two ranch hands mending a harness, they stopped their work and watched her. Their faces held a new expression, a mixture of pity and a kind of leering curiosity. She was no longer just the cook. She was a story, a piece of gossip, the girl who sang for the boss. When she reached the sanctuary of her kitchen, she slammed the sack of potatoes onto the floor. The sound echoed in the small space. She looked around the room, at the neatly stacked kindling, the silent pantry hinge, the smooth bench outside the window, the jar of golden honey. These objects, which had been sources of a quiet, wondering joy, now felt like evidence. They were exhibits in a trial she hadn't known she was a part of. Her throat felt tight, constricted. She looked at the dough she'd been about to prepare. The thought of humming, of letting any sound escape her lips, was impossible. Her songs had been private as her thoughts. Now they felt cheapened, exposed, misunderstood. So she pulled her voice back inside herself and locked it away. She stopped singing. The effect was immediate and profound. The kitchen, once filled with the warmth of her low melodies, fell silent. And in that silence, a coldness crept in. It was a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. It was the cold of an empty hearth, the hollow feeling of a space that has lost its soul. The work became just work again. The rhythm was gone. There was only the dull chop of a knife, the clatter of a pot, the sigh of the fire. The kitchen had stopped singing. Graham still came. The hoofprint still appeared in the dirt by the step. But something had shifted between them. The print was no longer so close to the door. It was a few feet further back, as if he were keeping a more respectful, or perhaps a more uncertain, distance. He left a bundle of freshly cut sage by the door one morning. Its clean, sharp scent, a balm in the tense air. But the gesture felt different now, tentative. The silence from the kitchen was a wall he did not seem to know how to breach. He was a man of actions, not words, and her silence had taken away the one thing his actions had been responding to. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. A heavy, relentless rain set in, turning the ranch into a sea of mud and misery. It was on one of these nights that Evelyn worked later than usual, preparing a hot meal for a group of men who had been out repairing a collapsed section of fence in the downpour. She was bone-tired, her muscles aching from the damp cold that had settled deep into the marrow of the world. When she finally finished, she banked the fire and prepared to make the short, miserable dash to her small room attached to the back of the main house. She was so exhausted. She didn't even bother to change out of her work boots, which were caked with mud and soaked through. She left them just inside the door of the cookhouse, too weary to even consider the effort of scraping them clean. Let them sit, she thought. She would deal with the mess in the morning. She slept a heavy, dreamless sleep, the sound of the rain drumming on the roof a constant, mournful lullaby. When she returned to the cookhouse before dawn, the rain had finally stopped. The air was washed clean and smelled of wet earth and pine. She pushed open the door, expecting to be greeted by the damp chill of the room and the sight of her muddy, forlorn boots. But that's not what she found. The first thing she noticed was the warmth. A low, gentle fire was already glowing in the stove, its heat pushing back the damp and filling the room with a welcoming embrace. And there, on the floor by the hearth, were her boots. They were not as she had left them. The mud was gone, every trace of it carefully scraped and wiped away. The leather, which had been stiff and cold, was now soft, supple, and warm to the touch. Someone had painstakingly cleaned them and then set them by the fire to dry slowly, rubbing them with a little oil to keep the leather from cracking. The laces had been removed, cleaned, and then threaded back through the eyelets, tied in a neat, careful bow. Evelyn stared at them. She slowly knelt down, her fingers tracing the clean seams of the leather. It was still warm. This hadn't been done hours ago. This had been done in the deep of the night, in the quiet hours just before dawn. Someone had come into her kitchen while she slept. Someone had seen her sodden, muddy boots. a small testament to her exhaustion, and had not walked past them. They had knelt on this very floor in the dark and had performed this small, humble act of care. And she knew, with a certainty that went deeper than thought, who it was. This was not an act for an audience. There was no one here to see it, to whisper about it, to twist it into gossip. The stables were dark. The bunkhouse was silent. Molly was asleep. This act had only one witness herself. This was a gift given not to the girl who sang, but to the woman who was tired. She touched the warm, clean leather, and in that simple, tactile moment, something inside her shifted. For weeks, she had been building a wall around her heart, mortaring it with silence and suspicion, protecting herself from the careless cruelty of others' words. But this one, silent, unseen act of kindness was a force stronger than any gossip. It did not try to batter the wall down. It simply found a small, forgotten crack and slipped through, warm and bright. A fissure appeared in the defensive wall inside her chest. Not a catastrophic break, but a tiny, hairline fracture, just wide enough for a little bit of light to get through. That day, as the rain began to fall again, a soft, whispering drizzle this time, Evelyn worked by the light of a lantern. The kitchen was her sanctuary once more. The sounds of the rain and the crackle of the burning pine in the stove were the only company she needed. And then, hesitantly, quietly, she began to hum. It was a new song, one she hadn't sung before, a simple melody that felt like the smell of rain and wood smoke. She wasn't singing for the stables, or for the kitchen, or even for the hoof print in the mud. She was singing for the pair of hands that had cleaned her boots. She was singing to the silence, sending a signal that she was still there, that the wall had been breached. As the melody grew a little stronger, she glanced toward the window. The world outside was a gray, watery blur, but for a fleeting second, a shape detached itself from the deeper shadows of the barn. It was the figure of a tall man in a long coat. He stopped on the covered porch of the stable, just at the edge of the rain. He stood there for a long moment, a dark, still silhouette against the gray afternoon. He did not approach the kitchen. He did not look toward the window. He just stood, listening. Then, as her song came to a quiet end, the figure turned and melted back into the shadows from which it had come. He had heard, and he had understood. Saturday arrived with a quiet, pearly light, the kind that seems to absorb sound. The week of rain had passed, leaving the world scoured and clean, the air tasting of damp earth and distant snow. Evelyn was sweeping the wooden step in front of the cookhouse, her movements rhythmic and methodical, when a shadow fell over her. She looked up, her broom stilled in her hands. Graham Thatcher was standing there, not 10 feet away. He wasn't on his horse. He was on foot, holding the reins of his big roan and another, smaller mare, a gentle-looking buckskin already saddled. He was not dressed for ranch work. He wore a cleaner coat, and his hat seemed to sit on his head with a more formal air. He looked as though he had been waiting, but he showed no impatience. He simply stood, a solid, quiet presence against the backdrop of the morning. He watched her for a moment, his gaze direct, and then he spoke. His voice was low, not a command, but a simple statement of fact. "Ride with me." Evelyn's heart gave a single, hard knock against her ribs. The broom felt suddenly heavy and clumsy in her hands. A dozen excuses, 100 reasons why she couldn't, rose up in her mind. The bread needed punching down. The day's stew needed starting. Molly would see. The men would talk. But when she looked at his face, at the calm certainty in his eyes, the excuses evaporated like mist in the morning sun. She had been living a life defined by the walls of her kitchen and the expectations of others. His 2 words were a door opening in that wall. She leaned the broom against the cookhouse, wiped her hands on her apron as if to wipe away her old duties, and untied it. She walked toward him, her worn work boots making soft sounds on the damp ground. He didn't smile. but the tightness around his eyes seemed to lessen. He held the reins of the buckskin mare out to her, and she took them. The leather was smooth and cool in her hand. The path he chose was not one of the main trails that crisscrossed the valley floor. He led her away from the ranch, past the last of the fences, and toward the rolling foothills that rose up to meet the mountains. Soon, the wide, gentle path gave way to a narrow track that was little more than a deer trail. It was not a path for show, not a place for a leisurely ride. It was a climb. The trail snaked upward through dense thickets of wild rose and hawthorn, their bare, thorny branches reaching out to snag at their clothes. Loose stones and scree shifted under the horse's hooves, requiring a careful, steady pace. Evelyn had to lean forward in her saddle, trusting the mare to find its footing. Her own focus narrowed to the patch of difficult ground directly in front of her. Graham rode just ahead, his broad back a constant, steady guide. He never looked back to see if she was following. He simply knew she would be. They didn't speak. The only sounds were the puffing breath of the horses, the clatter of a dislodged rock rolling down the slope, and the vast, sighing whisper of the wind as it moved through the pines higher up. This was not a courtship. It was a pilgrimage. After what felt like an hour of steady climbing, the trail leveled out. They emerged from the dense brush onto a wide, grassy bald at the very top of the hill. The wind was stronger here, a clean, cold current that carried the scent of pine and the promise of winter. It pushed her hair back from her face and filled her lungs with an air so pure it felt like a drink of cold water. Graham swung down from his horse and came to help her, his hands closing firmly around her waist to lift her down. For a moment, she was suspended between the saddle and the ground, held by his strength, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. He set her down gently, his hands dropping away the instant her feet were solidly on the ground. The view was breathtaking. From up here, the entire ranch was laid out below them, a miniature world of buildings and corrals nestled in the sweeping curve of the valley. The world of men looked small and tidy from this height, but it was the fences that held Evelyn's gaze. Down on the ground, they were rigid, uncompromising lines of wood and wire, barriers designed to divide and contain. From up here, she could see their true nature. They were not straight. They bent and flowed with the contours of the land, dipping into hollows and rising over gentle swells, following a logic that belonged not to man, but to the earth itself. The straight lines she saw every day were an illusion. The truth was a curve. Graham came to stand beside her, not close, but sharing the same view. He followed her gaze down to the sprawling network of his land. "Down there," he said. His voice carried on the wind. "It's all numbers, a constant, running tally in your head that never stops." He gestured with his chin toward the distant, tiny dots that were his cattle. So many head of cattle, so many tons of hay in the barn to see them through the winter, so many feet of fence to string, so many posts to set. The numbers press in on you. They tell you what you're worth, what you have, what you stand to lose. They can choke the breath right out of a man if you let them. He fell silent, looking down at the world he had built, the world that was in the process of building or breaking him. He had just given her a glimpse into the crushing weight of his own silence, the ledger book that ruled his life. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her face, and she pushed it back, feeling the sudden, strange urge to offer a truth of her own. "When I was 12, she began, her voice quieter than his, making him lean his head slightly to hear her. "My father lost our farm. I was sent to work for a family in town. On the first day, the lady of the house pointed at me and said to her husband, 'This is the new kitchen girl.' And that's what I became." She looked down at her own hands, at the calluses and the faint, pale tracery of old burns. "It's a name that sticks to you. It doesn't matter that my name is Evelyn. In every house, on every ranch, I was just the kitchen girl, or the cook, or the little cook girl. It's a name that tells you where you belong. It builds a fence around you that's harder to see than those, but just as real." She had never said that to anyone, had never even fully formed the thought in her own mind. But in the clean, honest air of the hilltop, the words came out, simple and unadorned. They had both spoken of their prisons, his made of numbers, hers made of a name. Graham listened, his expression unchanged, but a new kind of stillness came over him, a deep and profound attention. When she was finished, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. It was new. The leather was a rich, dark brown, and it was held shut by a simple leather thong. It was a beautiful object, well made and smelling of leather and clean paper. He held it in his palm, looking at it as if it were a stranger. "I bought this in Bozeman last spring," he said, his voice low and thoughtful. "I had this idea that I would write things down, the true things, not the numbers, not the tallies of cattle or the price of feed, but the way the light hits the mountains in the morning, or the sound the ice makes on the creek when it's breaking up. The real things, but I never wrote a single word." He ran his thumb over the smooth, unmarked cover. "The pages are all empty. It's hard to find the words for the truth when you spend all day counting things." He turned and held the book out to her. "You should have it." Evelyn stared at the book, then at his face. She was confused. "What for? I can't write like that." "You don't have to," he said. His gaze was steady, and in it she saw a deep, unwavering conviction. "If you write down your songs, if you put the words to the melodies your mother taught you, then they become real. They become more than just something that fades on the air. They become a thing a person can hold. People will see you have something to say. They won't just hear a kitchen girl humming. They'll read the words of Evelyn Ward." The wind howled around them, a wild, lonely sound. But in the space between them, a profound quiet had fallen. He was offering her a gift far greater than a flower or a jar of honey. He was offering her a name, her own. She looked from his earnest, serious face to the empty book, a vessel waiting to be filled. The possibility of it, the sheer, terrifying weight of it, made her tremble. She found her voice, though it was barely a whisper. "Why me?" Graham looked away from her then, his gaze fixed on the distant, snow-capped peaks. He seemed to be considering his answer carefully, searching for the truest words. "Because I've lived with silence long enough to know when it's speaking," he said, finally. "Your silence spoke, and then your music spoke. It's the most honest thing I've heard in this valley in years." He didn't need to say more. In that one sentence, he had told her everything. He had told her that he had not just heard her. He had understood her. He understood the loneliness of the sound, the solace in it, the truth of it. Evelyn reached out and took the book from his hand. Her fingers brushed against his, and a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun passed between them. The leather felt solid and real, a tangible thing in a world that had suddenly become vast and full of possibility. They stood there for a long time after that, not speaking. There was no need for words. The wind spoke for them, a long, sighing monologue that told the story of the mountains and the seasons. And a third thing had joined them on the hilltop, a new kind of silence. It was not the empty, aching silence of loneliness, nor the tense, watchful silence of the gossipers. It was a shared silence, a comfortable, breathing thing that sat between them like an old friend, full of understanding and peace. As the sun began to climb higher, casting shorter shadows on the ground, they knew it was time to go. The ride down was as quiet as the ride up, but the world felt different, brighter. The thorny branches no longer seemed to be snagging at her, but simply brushing past. When they reached the cookhouse, he helped her down again, his hands just as brief and respectful as before. She stood before him, holding the leather-bound book to her chest. She clutched it tight, her knuckles white, pressing it against her heart. It felt as if she were not just holding a book. It felt as if, for the very first time in her life, she was holding her own voice. The summer jubilee exploded into the town square like a dropped crate of fireworks. After a long season of hard work, the entire valley had turned out to celebrate, hungry for noise and color and company. A frantic fiddle sawed the air, weaving a tune that made feet stomp and dust rise in thick, red clouds. Booths had been thrown up, draped in calico and bunting, offering everything from horse liniment to candied apples. The air was a thick stew of smells: roasting meat, sweet popcorn, horse manure, and the cheap perfume of the saloon girls mingling with the honest scent of dusty denim. Evelyn walked into the heart of it, a small, quiet island in a loud, swirling sea. She moved carefully, her focus narrowed to the two heavy burdens in her hands. In one arm, she balanced a wooden tray laden with 3 perfect pies: 1 apple, 1 cherry, 1 gooseberry, their latticed crusts baked to an even, glistening gold. In her other hand, she carried a wide, shallow bowl of brandied peaches, the syrupy globes gleaming like trapped sunlight. These were her offerings, the tangible products of her quiet kitchen, the only voice she knew how to use in a crowd this size. She was heading for the long trestle tables set up for the community meal, navigating a path through laughing children and boisterous ranchers. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, and for the first time, she did not flinch. The leather-bound book Graham had given her was tucked away in her room, but the feel of it was imprinted on her mind. It was a private armor, a secret source of strength. She was almost to the tables when a figure stepped directly into her path, blocking her way. Evelyn looked up from the careful placement of her feet and into the cool, dismissive eyes of Beatrice Thorne. Beatrice was the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a man whose wealth was older and more ostentatious than Graham Thatcher's. She was dressed in a gown of pale blue silk that seemed to shimmer in the harsh afternoon sun, a stark and deliberate contrast to Evelyn's simple, clean work dress. A parasol, frilled with lace, rested on her shoulder, casting a delicate, proprietary shadow over her face. She was flanked by 2 other women, their expressions a perfect mirror of Beatrice's own condescending amusement. "Well, look what we have here," Beatrice said, her voice high and clear, designed to carry over the fiddle music. She let her gaze travel slowly down from Evelyn's face to the pies, then to the peaches, a small, disdainful smile playing on her lips. The Thatcher Ranch's kitchen girl, bringing out the sweets. Evelyn said nothing, her knuckles white where she gripped the tray and the bowl. She tried to step around them, but Beatrice shifted, blocking her again. "I hear," Beatrice continued, tapping a gloved finger against her chin, "that you've developed quite a talent for singing in your little cookhouse. Tell me, is it true what they say? Can a simple kitchen melody truly climb all the way up the front steps of the main house?" The words, sharp and barbed, struck Evelyn with a physical force. It was Molly's kitchen gossip, now dressed up in silk and presented in the center of the town square. The 2 women beside Beatrice let out high, tittering laughs. The sound was like the shattering of glass. It cut through the festive noise, and suddenly, the people nearby fell silent, heads turned, eyes full of a hungry curiosity, fixed on the scene. The circle of listeners widened. The laughter spread, a ripple moving through the crowd. It wasn't a sound of joy, but a cold, mocking noise that seemed to suck the warmth from the summer air. It felt like a pail of ice water thrown down her back, a sudden, shocking chill that made her skin prickle and her breath catch in her throat. Her brief, fragile confidence crumbled to dust. She was 12 years old again, standing in a stranger's kitchen, being given a name that was not her own. Her arms began to tremble under the weight of her offerings. The pies, which had been a source of pride, now felt like an anchor, a heavy symbol of her station. She couldn't hold them any longer. With a slow, defeated movement, she bent down and placed the tray of pies and the bowl of peaches on the dusty ground. The air, which had been full of life and music, suddenly felt tight and thin, like a shirt that had shrunk in the wash. She couldn't breathe it. She had to get away. Without a word, without looking at Beatrice's triumphant face, Evelyn turned her back on the crowd and began to walk away. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to escape the tightening circle of eyes. Then, a new sound cut through the murmuring and the laughter. It was the rhythmic, powerful beat of a horse's hooves, moving at a fast canter. The crowd, startled, parted instinctively. A great roan horse plunged into the open space, pulling up so sharply that it threw dirt from its forelegs. It was Graham. He sat in the saddle, a figure of absolute stillness in the chaotic scene. He was dusty from the trail, his hat low on his brow, his face grim. He looked utterly out of place, a piece of the hard, working wilderness dropped into the middle of a town party. His eyes, cold and flinty as river stones, swept over the crowd, missing nothing. He saw Beatrice and her friends, their smiles frozen on their faces. He saw the pies and the peaches sitting abandoned in the dust. He saw Evelyn's retreating back. He didn't dismount. He didn't raise his voice. When he spoke, his words were quiet, yet they carried across the sudden, tense silence with absolute clarity. He did not look at Beatrice. He addressed the crowd, every man and woman who had stood by and watched. "I spend my days working," he began, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I work this land, and so do the men who ride for me. We work until our hands are raw and our backs ache. And at the end of the day, we are fed. We are sustained by labor that is just as honest and just as hard as our own." He shifted his weight in the saddle, his gaze moving from one face to another, pinning them in place. There are two kinds of labor in this world. There is the kind that builds, that mends, that feeds. It is done in quiet, with dignity, and it asks for nothing but a fair wage. Then there is another kind of labor, the kind that tears down, that soils, that starves the spirit. It is the work of gossip, the trade of rumor. It is an easy, worthless thing, and its only wage is the cheap satisfaction of seeing another brought low. His eyes finally settled on Beatrice, though he still did not speak her name. His gaze was flat, empty of any emotion save a deep, profound contempt. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken words. "I would rather marry a woman who knows how to feed a man's body," Graham said, his voice dropping even lower, making everyone lean in to hear, than one who only knows how to feed a rumor. A fork, held in a stunned hand, slipped from someone's grasp and clattered onto a nearby plate. The small, sharp sound was like a gunshot in the dead silence. The crowd was frozen, a tableau of shocked faces and open mouths. No one moved. No one breathed. It was as if the entire jubilee had been turned to stone. Graham did not wait for applause. He was not seeking their approval. He had delivered his verdict, and he was done. He pulled on the reins, turning the big roan's head. The horse, eager to be away, moved off, its hooves kicking up small puffs of red dust. He rode out of the square without a backward glance, his straight back a final, unyielding statement. His words remained behind, settling into the hearts of the people who had heard them. A slow, creeping shame began to move through the crowd. Men who had laughed now looked at the ground, studying their boots. Women who had whispered now busied themselves with their children. Beatrice Thorne's face was a mask of pale fury. Her moment of triumph turned to ash in her mouth. Evelyn had stopped when she heard the horse. She had turned and watched the entire scene. Hidden in the shadow of a canvas tent, she had seen his arrival, heard his words, and felt them land inside her like a shield, extinguishing the fire of her humiliation. He was gone. The crowd was beginning to stir, breaking apart, eager to escape the uncomfortable silence. Evelyn took a deep breath. The air fit in her lungs again. She walked back out into the open, back to the spot where her offering sat in the dust. She knelt, ignoring the stares, and picked up the heavy bowl of peaches. Then she stood and lifted the tray of pies. She walked the final few feet to the long trestle table and set them down. She placed them with a firm, deliberate motion. Her hand came to rest on the rough, splintery edge of the table, her fingers curling around the solid wood. It was a grounding touch, a connection to the world of simple, honest labor he had just defended. He had not rescued her. He had not ridden in to carry her away. He had simply handed her back her own strength, and as she stood there, her hand resting on the rough-hewn plank, she felt herself stand taller, solid and sure, rooted from the inside out. The wind changed. It was not a gradual shift, but a sudden, violent pivot. One moment, the air was still, holding the cold, brittle silence of a late autumn evening. The next, a brutal fist of wind came roaring down from the north, a polar beast that had been hiding behind the mountains, finally unleashed. It slammed into the small cookhouse with the force of a physical blow, rattling the very bones of the building. Inside, Evelyn was banking the fire for the night. The embers in the cast-iron stove glowed a deep, pulsing orange, a pocket of warmth against the encroaching dark. She had just placed the heavy iron lid over the firebox when the wind hit. A tremendous groan came from the stone chimney, a sound of protest from deep within the earth. Then it happened. The airflow, which had for years moved obediently up and out, reversed in an instant. A great, foul breath of thick, black smoke belched from the stove's vents. A sudden choking cloud that filled the kitchen with the acrid smell of soot and hot tar. Evelyn staggered back, her hand flying to her mouth, coughing. The smoke was acrid, greasy. It wasn't the clean smoke of burning pine. It was the foul, concentrated essence of 1,000 old fires. Before she could even get to the door, a second, more violent gust of wind hit the building. The single window, which she had propped open a few inches, slammed shut with a deafening crack. The sound of a trap being sprung. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her. The room was sealed. The backdraft in the stove was furious now. A spray of glowing embers shot from a seam near the firebox door, scattering like angry red insects across the floor. Most of them died instantly on the cool stone hearth. But one, a fat, malevolent coal, landed on a damp rag she'd left by the wood box. It should have gone out. The rag was wet, but the coal was intensely hot. It hissed and sizzled, a tiny battle of fire and water. For a moment, it seemed the water would win. Then, a thin, greasy tendril of gray smoke began to rise from the cloth. The cotton fibers, impregnated with oil and grease from months of wiping down the stove, began to smolder. The smoke thickened, a foul-smelling plume that coiled and rose, joining the black cloud already descending from the ceiling. It was no longer just smoke. It was a living thing, a creeping beast that began to devour the air in the room. Evelyn lunged for the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. The smoke was a physical presence now, thick and oily. It stung her eyes, making them stream with tears. She grabbed the iron latch, her fingers fumbling against the cold metal. She pulled. It didn't budge. The force of the wind pressing against the outside of the door, combined with the warped old wood, had jammed it shut. She pulled again, her breath catching in her throat, a ragged, useless gasp. The latch was stuck fast. Her lungs screamed for air. The smoke was a thick blanket, hot and suffocating. A burning sensation seared her throat, as if she had swallowed a handful of hot coals. She began to cough, deep, racking coughs that tore at her chest but brought no relief. She was breathing poison. Disoriented, she stumbled backward, away from the door. Her back slammed into something hard and intensely hot. The stove. A jolt of sharp, searing pain shot through the thin fabric of her dress. She cried out, a small, choked sound that was instantly swallowed by the swirling smoke. She threw herself forward, away from the heat, her shoulder colliding with a stack of copper pots on a low shelf. The pots went down with a deafening, chaotic crash of metal on stone. Darkness began to creep in at the edges of her vision. The single lantern on the table became a blurry, distant star. The smoke was a predator, coiling around her, squeezing the life from her. Her knees buckled. The stone floor rushed up to meet her. The last thing she saw was the dark, writhing shape of the smoke. A beast come to claim her. Outside, Graham was walking from the stables to the main house. The wind tore at his coat, a raw, brutal force that promised a bitter night. He had his head down, his thoughts on the morning's muster, when the sound reached him over the howl of the wind. It wasn't a loud sound, but it was sharp, unnatural. The clang and clatter of falling metal. It came from the cookhouse. He stopped dead, his head snapping up. He looked at the small, dark building. There was no light from the window, but a thin, dark wisp was curling from beneath the eaves. It wasn't the clean, pale smoke of a healthy fire. It was black, oily, wrong. He didn't think, he ran. He covered the 30 yards in a few powerful strides, his boots pounding the hard, cold ground. He reached the cookhouse door and grabbed the latch. It wouldn't give. He threw his shoulder against the solid wood. The frame groaned, but held. Smoke, thick and black, was now pouring from the cracks around the door. He could smell the terrifying, greasy scent of something burning that shouldn't be. He took 2 steps back, lowered his head, and drove his shoulder into the door with all the force of his body. There was a sharp crack of splintering wood. The door shuddered, but still held. He hit it again, a second impact that felt like a collision with a stone wall. This time, the wood around the latch assembly gave way with a final, agonized shriek. The door flew inward. Smoke erupted from the doorway like a wounded animal, a great black choking wave that billowed out into the night. Graham charged in, his arm thrown up over his face, his eyes squeezed shut against the stinging darkness. He took 2 steps into the heat and the chaos, shouting her name, Evelyn. The only answer was the hiss of the smoldering rag and the roar of the wind outside. He dropped to his hands and knees, where the air was marginally clearer. He could see nothing. He crawled forward, his hands sweeping the stone floor, calling her name again and again. His fingers brushed against something soft, the hem of her dress. He followed it, finding her small, still form crumpled on the floor, just a few feet from the door. He wasted no time. He scooped her into his arms. She was limp, a dead weight, a terrible, cold fear, sharper than the wind, seized his heart. As he lifted her, he saw a tiny, flickering flame licking at the sleeve of her dress, where it had brushed against the smoldering rag. Without thought, his free hand came down, smothering the flame, his palm absorbing the heat without feeling it. He wrapped the heavy wool of his coat around her, shielding her face, and turned, barging back out into the clean, cold, knife-like wind. He didn't stop. He ran, carrying her across the dark yard, past the bunkhouse, past her own small, empty room, and straight toward the main house. He kicked the front door open and carried her inside, into the great room, where a large, welcoming fire burned in the massive stone hearth. He laid her down gently on the thick bearskin rug before the fire, the flickering light playing over her pale, still face. Her hair had come undone, and it fanned out around her head like a dark halo. There was a smudge of soot on her cheek, and her lips were tinged with blue. For a moment, he could not move, frozen by the terrifying possibility that he was too late. Then his training, his instincts, the deep-rooted pragmatism of a man who fights nature for a living, took over. He ran to the kitchen, grabbing a basin of cold water and a stack of clean towels. He knelt beside her. Not sat. He knelt, a position of prayer, of supplication. He dipped a cloth in the cold water and began to tenderly wash the soot from her face. He called her name, his voice low and urgent, a sound stripped of all its usual authority, leaving only raw, pleading fear. Evelyn, Evelyn, can you hear me? There was no response. The night stretched into an eternity. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked off the seconds, each one a small, metallic hammer blow against the silence. The hands moved with an agonizing slowness, marking the passage of a night that seemed as long and as cold as an entire winter. Graham did not move from his spot. He did not sit. He remained on his knees beside her, a tireless, solitary sentinel. He changed the cool cloths on her forehead. He chafed her cold hands between his own, trying to will his own warmth, his own life, into her. He spoke to her, quiet, broken words, telling her to breathe, to fight, to come back. The great house was silent around them, the rest of the ranch asleep, unaware of the life-and-death vigil being held in its heart. The fire in the hearth burned down to glowing coals, and the room grew colder. The first pale, ghostly light of dawn began to filter through the tall windows, painting the room in shades of gray. It was the hour of deepest cold, the hour when life is at its lowest ebb. Graham's hope, which he had clung to so fiercely through the long, dark hours, began to fray. He looked at her still, pale face, and a despair he had never known threatened to overwhelm him. He was holding her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it, when he felt it. It was the faintest flicker of movement, so small he thought he might have imagined it. A tiny, almost imperceptible pressure against his palm. He stopped breathing. His entire world narrowed to the feeling of her hand in his. Then it came again, stronger this time. Her fingers, weak and trembling, curled around his. They tightened, a fragile, desperate grip. An answer sent across a vast, dark distance. He looked down at her face. Her eyelids fluttered. Slowly, painfully, they opened. Her eyes, unfocused at first, found his. They were cloudy with confusion and pain, but they were alive. She was there. She was back. Graham bowed his head, his forehead coming to rest on their joined hands. A single, shuddering breath escaped him. The first full breath he had taken all night. The sun had forgotten to rise many times during the long, dark hours. But in the end, at the last possible moment, it had remembered, and it had found her. News of the fire, and of the rescue, traveled faster than the north wind that had caused it. The story did not move as gossip, whispered behind cupped hands in the stables. It was spoken in the open, in tones of hushed respect, a stark and simple narrative of courage. Graham Thatcher, a man known for his quiet, unyielding authority, had torn a door from its frame and walked into a black inferno to carry his cook out of the smoke. He had knelt by her side all night, a silent, unmoving guardian. These were the facts, and they needed no embellishment. The change on the ranch was palpable when Evelyn, pale and still weak, took her first tentative steps out of the main house 2 days later. The men no longer looked at her with pity or leering curiosity. Their gazes were different now. Jedediah, the old rancher who had been the first to gossip, was the first to approach her. He stopped a respectful distance away, his hat held awkwardly in his gnarled hands. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We're glad to see you on your feet." He nodded, a gesture of profound, unstated apology, and then retreated, as if he had said too much. The other men followed his lead, their greetings brief, their eyes full of a new, quiet deference. She was no longer just the kitchen girl who sang. She was the woman who had survived the smoke, the woman the boss himself had pulled from the jaws of death. On the third morning, a wagon rattled into the yard. It was not a supply wagon. It was loaded with fresh-cut pine lumber, stacks of new shingles, and 2 men Evelyn had never seen before, carpenters from town. They did not report to the main house or ask for the foreman. They parked their wagon beside the blackened, smoke-stained shell of the cookhouse and began to unload their tools. They had not been summoned. They had simply been sent. The work began with a sound of clean destruction, the rhythmic thud of a sledgehammer knocking out the charred window frame, the screech of a crowbar prying up the damaged roof boards. The old, cramped structure was being dismantled, its wounded parts removed to make way for something new. A small crowd of off-duty ranch hands gathered to watch, not out of idle curiosity, but with a sense of communal purpose. Soon, one of them, then another, stepped forward to help, hauling away the blackened timbers, their actions a silent, collective atonement. The reconstruction was not a simple repair. It was a reimagining. The new roof was raised, its pitch steeper, creating a high vaulted ceiling inside that made the small space feel open and airy. On the east wall, where before there had been only solid, blind timber, a wide new window was framed out, a clear pane of glass to welcome the morning sun. The men worked with a steady, unhurried rhythm, the air filled with the clean, sharp scent of sawdust and the syncopated percussion of their hammers. It was the sound of something broken being made whole again, being made better. While the carpenters worked on the wooden frame, another man arrived. He was a stonemason, a quiet, methodical craftsman who set to work dismantling the old, smoke-damaged chimney and the cast-iron stove that had been the cause of the disaster. He did not replace it with another iron box. Stone by stone, he began to build a new hearth, a deep, wide fireplace and oven combination made from smooth, gray river rock. It was a structure of permanence and safety. Its stones fitted together with a patient, perfect precision. It was the kind of hearth one would build in a home, not a shed. Evelyn watched it all from a chair placed in the sun, wrapped in a blanket Graham had insisted she use. She was still recovering, her throat raw, her lungs aching with every deep breath. But she could not stay inside. She needed to see this. She watched as the new shelves were installed, their pine surfaces sanded down until they were as smooth as polished bone. She watched as the light, for the first time, poured into the room from the east, tracing a bright, hopeful path across the dusty floor, illuminating the floating motes of sawdust like a kind of golden, celestial powder. On the second day of the build, as the roof was being shingled, Graham came and stood beside her chair. He didn't speak for a long time, just watched the men work, his hands in his pockets. Then, he pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat. It was old, the creases worn soft, the edges yellowed. He unfolded it and handed it to her. It was a rough architectural sketch, drawn in a confident, if untrained, hand. It showed a small, freestanding building with a stone hearth and a wide front window. It was a dream, a plan for a place that was more than just a functional kitchen. Scrawled across the top of the page, in his strong, clear handwriting, were 3 words: "The Quiet Stove." Beneath the title, he had added a few more lines, as if making notes to himself. A place for travelers, for the men, a place for the songs that feed them. Evelyn looked from the drawing to his face. The reason for the name needed no explanation. The silence, the smoke, the song, the stove, it was all there, in those 3 simple words. It was the entire story of the last few months, captured in a name. He wasn't just rebuilding a cookhouse. He was building a sanctuary. He was giving her silence a home. When the work was done, the building stood transformed. It was the same small structure, yet it was entirely new. The air inside smelled of fresh pine, clean mortar, and possibility. The light from the new window filled every corner. It was no longer a place of solitary labor. It felt like a gathering place, even when empty. Evelyn stepped inside alone, running her hand over the smooth, cool surface of the new stone hearth. She walked to the new, long wooden table, built to replace the one that had been too badly scorched. She took her mother's old recipe book from a box of salvaged items and opened it. She didn't turn to a recipe. She turned to the blank page where a small, folded note still rested. "I didn't know kitchens could sing." She closed the book, a quiet resolve settling over her. The next day, she began to cook again. The menu she chose was simple, elemental, a rich, slow-simmered beef stew that filled the air with the scent of herbs and garlic, skillets of golden cornbread, its crust crispy, its center moist and tender. For dessert, a deep dish molasses pie, its dark, spicy sweetness a promise of warmth and comfort. She found a small tin can and went outside, gathering a handful of late-season mountain daisies, their purple petals a defiant burst of color against the brown autumn landscape. She put them in the can with some water and set them on the new, wide windowsill, a splash of life in the clean, new room. And as she worked, as she stirred the stew and kneaded the dough for the cornbread, she began to sing. Her voice was different. It was no longer the quiet, private humming of before. It was clearer, stronger, the notes rising to fill the high, new ceiling. She was not looking for a listener. She was not performing for an unseen audience. She was simply filling the beautiful new space with the sound that belonged there. She was singing to the new walls, to the clean light, to the quiet stove, claiming it as her own. A new routine began. Each morning, well before the sun came up, Graham would enter the kitchen. He never knocked. His presence was an assumed and welcome part of the dawn. While she measured out flour or started the coffee, he would build the fire in the new hearth, his movements efficient and sure. Then he would take a clean cloth and wipe down the long tables, his silent labor a steady rhythm that harmonized with her own. They rarely spoke. There was no need. The language of shared work, of comfortable presence in the pre-dawn quiet, was more eloquent than any words could be. One morning, a young ranch hand, the same boy Silas who had once gossiped in the stables, poked his head through the open door, drawn by the smell of coffee and bacon. He looked around the transformed room, at the warm glow from the stone hearth, the clean light from the window, the quiet industry of Evelyn and Graham working in the same space. A look of awe came over his face. "It's like a church in here," he whispered, as if afraid to break the spell. Graham looked up from the table he was wiping. He glanced at Evelyn, who was now humming softly as she sliced bread. A rare, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. "She's the one who made it sacred," he replied, his voice low and certain. The day the quiet stove officially opened for the ranch, the men lined up outside the door. Their hats were in their hands, their boots scraped clean of mud. They filed in not with the usual boisterous clamor of hungry men, but with a quiet respect, as if entering a place that demanded a certain reverence. Among them were the same men who had whispered and laughed at her expense at the summer jubilee. They didn't meet her eye, but they took the bowls of stew she'd ladled out with a mumbled, "Grateful thank you, ma'am." The rich, savory steam that rose from the bowls seemed to melt away the last vestiges of old bitterness, the salt of old mockery dissolving in the honest warmth of good food. They sat at the long tables, and they ate, and in the quiet, healing sanctuary of the new kitchen, they listened to the sound of a woman who had found her voice. Success, like a healthy crop, attracts both admirers and pests. The quiet stove thrived. Its reputation spread beyond the ranch, carried by travelers and ranch hands into the town. It became a known way station, a place where a man could get a hot meal that tasted of home and sit for a spell in a room that felt both peaceful and alive. The warmth of the stone hearth was matched only by the warmth of the woman who ran it, a woman whose quiet songs had become as much a part of the valley's landscape as the whispering grass. This success did not go unnoticed. The first knock of a new kind of trouble came not at the kitchen door, but at the main house. Mr. Henderson, the town banker, a man whose heart ticked in time with an adding machine, paid a visit to Graham. After the usual talk of cattle prices and weather, Henderson leaned back in his chair, a shrewd glint in his eye. "That little eatery of yours is doing a remarkable business. Thatcher," he began, his voice smooth as worn leather. "Remarkable. People are talking. It's adding real value to your property." Graham remained impassive. "It feeds the men." "It does more than that," Henderson countered. "It's a commercial enterprise, by all rights. The lease on that parcel of land, the one the building sits on, ought to reflect its increased profitability. A modest increase in your annual land lease payment to the bank would only be prudent." The suggestion hung in the air, a cold, metallic thing. It was a threat wrapped in the language of business, a reminder that for every man who builds, there is another who holds the deed to the land beneath. A second, more insidious campaign began at the same time, orchestrated by a man named Finch, the ranch's former manager whom Graham had dismissed a year prior for his cruel handling of the men and his penny-pinching dishonesty. Finch saw Evelyn's rise and Graham's quiet patronage of it as a personal affront, a disruption of the natural order he had once overseen. He couldn't attack Graham directly, so he aimed his poison at the heart of the new ranch, the quiet stove. A new rumor began to circulate, different from the first. It was a sly, sophisticated whisper. "She's clever, that one." The new story went, "That little kitchen is just the first step. Mark my words. She's not singing for stew. She's singing for a master bedroom. The quiet stove is just a stepping stone to the main house." The rumor was designed to strip the story of its romance and repaint it as a tale of cold, calculating ambition. It sought to turn Graham's respect for her into a weakness, and her resilience into a form of manipulation. One afternoon, a well-dressed man on a fine-looking bay horse rode into the yard. He introduced himself as Mr. Abernathy, a merchant from Bozeman who was opening a new hotel and restaurant. He had come to see Evelyn. He sat at one of the long tables, accepted a cup of coffee, and laid out an offer that was as direct as it was startling. "Miss Ward," he said, his voice businesslike but not unkind, "your reputation precedes you. I have heard nothing but praise for your cooking and for the atmosphere you create. I am prepared to offer you the position of head chef at my new establishment in town. You would have a brand new kitchen, twice the size of this one, a staff to command, and a salary that would provide you with a very comfortable and secure future. Your name, of course, would be on the menu." Evelyn listened, her hands still, her mind reeling. He was offering her everything a woman in her position was supposed to want: security, professional respect, financial independence, a name of her own, printed for all to see. It was a legitimate, respectable path out of the gray, uncertain world she had always inhabited. It was a safe harbor. She gave him a non-committal answer, promising to consider his offer. As he rode away, she felt the weight of the decision settle on her shoulders. That evening, as she was cleaning up, Molly came over from the main house to return a large cast-iron pot. The older woman had been different since the fire. Her sharp edges softened, her sneers replaced by a grudging, watchful silence. She set the heavy pot by the sink and began to scrub it herself, her back to Evelyn. "Heard you had a visitor," Molly said to the pot, her voice gruff. "The hotel man." Evelyn nodded, even though Molly couldn't see her. "Yes." Molly continued to scrub, her movements methodical, scraping away at a stubborn patch of burned stew. "It's a good offer," she said, still not turning. "A safe one. No one can whisper about a woman who earns her own wages fair and square." She paused, her scrubbing slowing for a moment. She finally turned her head just enough for Evelyn to see her profile. The usual hardness in her face was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like concern. "Choose carefully. You hear," she said, her voice low and serious. "This world ain't kind to women who are given things. It's kinder to the ones who take." With that, she turned back to her work. The conversation over, it was the most honest advice she had ever given anyone, a piece of hard-won, bitter wisdom from a woman who had fought her own battles. The next morning, in the pre-dawn quiet, the choice was laid before her again, but in a very different form. She and Graham were working in their now familiar silent rhythm. He had just finished building the fire when he placed a sheaf of papers on the table next to the dough she was kneading. "I spoke with my lawyer yesterday," he said, his voice even. He did not look at her, but at the papers, as if they were a neutral third party in the room. "These are partnership documents. They make you co-owner of the quiet stove. 50%, the name, the building, the business." Evelyn's hand stilled in the dough. She stared at the legal documents, at the dense black type and the lines waiting for signatures. "There are no conditions," he continued, his voice quiet but firm, as if anticipating her unspoken fears. "This has nothing to do with anything else. It is a business arrangement. You built this. You deserve to own it." He finally looked at her, his gaze direct and clear. "The papers also stipulate that 20% of any profits are to be set aside in a fund for any ranch hand who falls on hard times, sickness, injury, a family in need. This place should feed more than just a man's hunger." She looked at him, at his serious, earnest face, and she understood. This was not a cage, gilded or otherwise. It was a key, Mr. Abernathy was offering her a salary. Graham was offering her a purpose. He was offering her a partnership, not just with him, but with the entire community of men this place served. It was a terrifying, beautiful, and complicated offer. She was torn. The life Mr. Abernathy offered was simple, clean, and safe. The whispers would stop. Her future would be secure. The life Graham was offering was a continuation of the one she had, a life intertwined with his, a life of shared labor and shared purpose, but one that would forever be subject to the judgment and speculation of others. Was the freedom of her voice worth the safety of her name? Later that day, when the kitchen was quiet, she sat at the table. The two offers laid out before her, one a verbal promise of security, the other a legal document of partnership. She felt lost. She got up and retrieved the leather-bound book he had given her on the hilltop. She had not had much time to write, but she had managed to fill the first page. She opened it. In her own neat, careful script, she had written out the words to a song she had composed in her head during the days after the fire. It wasn't one of her mother's old tunes. It was her own. It was called "The Ballad of Smoke and Bread." It was a simple song about how a person can be lost in the smoke and how the simple, honest work of making bread can lead them back to the light. It was the story of her own survival. She read the words, her words, and she knew. Her voice wasn't just a melody. It was the story of this place, of this kitchen, of this life. To leave would be to abandon the very song she had just learned to write. That evening, when Graham came for his meal, she was waiting for him. The partnership papers were still on the table. "I cannot accept your offer as it is written," she said, her voice clear and steady. A shadow of disappointment passed over his face, so fleeting she almost missed it. "And I cannot accept Mr. Abernathy's offer at all," she continued. She pushed the papers back toward him. "This kitchen isn't for sale, not for a salary, and not for a partnership. It's for sharing." She looked him directly in the eye, her resolve solid. "I will accept one condition, that this place, the Quiet Stove, is never owned by one person, or even two, that it belongs to the ranch itself, and that its purpose will always be what you wrote on that paper to help the men who work it. I will be its caretaker, and you can be the man who chops the wood." For the first time since she had known him, a true, genuine smile broke across Graham Thatcher's face. It was not a large smile, but it was as bright and as welcome as the morning sun through the east window. It was the smile of a man who had just had a great weight lifted from his shoulders, a man who had put a question to the world and had received the one right answer. "I can do that," he said, his voice filled with a warmth she had never heard before. But as their new, unspoken partnership was being forged in the lamplight, a figure stood in the shadows outside the new window, listening. It was Finch, the former manager. He had seen Abernathy leave, had seen the lawyer's papers, and he had heard her final words. He saw the smile on Graham's face, a smile of a victory he could not stand. He turned away from the warm light of the window, his face a mask of bitter resentment. He walked back toward the darkness of the stables, a quiet, venomous promise forming in his mind. This was not the end. He would find another way. He would make things difficult, A new, more dangerous knot was just beginning to be tied. The town meeting was held in the courthouse, a stark, rectangular building that smelled of old paper, stale tobacco, and the dried dust of the law. The room was packed, the benches filled with a cross-section of the valley ranchers in their Sunday best, merchants in stiff collars, blacksmiths and tradesmen with hands that could never quite be scrubbed clean. There was a tense, formal air in the room, a feeling that this was not a community gathering but a public trial. At the front of the room, behind a long, scarred wooden table, sat the 3 members of the town council. In the front row of the public benches sat Finch, his face a mask of civic concern, flanked by the banker, Mr. Henderson, who looked profoundly bored, as if this were all a tedious but necessary formality. The chairman of the council, a portly store owner named Miller, cleared his throat and called the meeting to order. "We are here," he announced, "to discuss a formal complaint regarding the operating license of a food service establishment on the Thatcher property, known as the Quiet Stove. Concerns have been raised regarding public safety, fire risk, and proper licensing." Finch stood up, holding a piece of paper. "Mr. Chairman," he began, his voice oozing false humility, "we are all glad that the young woman, Miss Ward, survived her unfortunate accident. However, that very accident proves our point. The structure is a known fire trap. Its chimney is of a rustic, unapproved design to allow it to operate as a public eatery. Serving travelers and townsfolk is an unacceptable risk to public safety. This is not a personal matter. It is a matter of prudent civic governance." Henderson, the banker, added his own dry commentary without standing. "Furthermore, the establishment is operating in a gray area. Legally speaking, is it a private cookhouse or a commercial restaurant? If it's the latter, it requires a commercial license, which carries a substantially higher fee and more stringent regulations." The debate went back and forth, a volley of legalistic arguments and veiled accusations. The words safety, regulation, and precedent were used like clubs. No one mentioned songs or rescued lives or clean boots. They spoke only of the cold, hard letter of the law, a language designed to dissect and diminish the spirit of a place. Graham sat near the back, his face like granite. His lawyers had advised him that this was not his fight to lead. If he spoke, it would be seen as a powerful man protecting his personal interests. The voice that mattered, the only voice that could win this, was Evelyn's. Finally, Chairman Miller looked out over the crowd. "Does the proprietor of the establishment, Miss Ward, wish to speak?" A hush fell over the room. Every head turned. Evelyn stood up. She was dressed in a simple, dark blue dress, the cleanest and best she owned. She held no papers in her hands. She walked to the front of the room and stood before the council, her back straight, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She was not a petitioner. She was a woman reporting for duty. She did not look at Finch or Henderson. She addressed the council, but her voice was clear and steady, meant for everyone in the room to hear. "Gentlemen," she began, "the concerns for safety are valid. The fire was real, and the risk was real." She paused, letting the honesty of her admission settle in the room. "That is why the new Quiet Stove is not the same as the old one. The new hearth is built of solid river stone, with a firebox lined with fire brick, to a design approved by the mason who built it. The roof has been raised 2 feet to improve ventilation. The chimney flue has been rebuilt and draws cleanly. No matter which way the wind blows, we have dug a firebreak trench, 10 feet wide, around the entire building, and we have established rules." She began to tick them off, her voice gaining confidence with each practical detail. "The fire is never left unattended. A fresh bucket of water is placed by the hearth every morning and every night. The ashes are removed only when cold and are disposed of in a covered metal bin 100 feet from any structure. There is a fire watch schedule. I am on duty during the day, one of the ranch hands. Jedediah is on duty at night, "We are not careless, we are vigilant." She had answered their practical arguments with a barrage of practical facts. She had shown them that she was not just a cook. She was a professional, a manager who understood risk and took responsibility. A low murmur of approval moved through the benches. She waited for it to die down, and then her tone shifted. But the quiet stove is more than just stone and wood and rules. It is a place of service. She reached into a small bag she carried and brought out the leather-bound book. She opened it to a page near the front. "I am not a poet," she said, her voice becoming softer, more personal. "But sometimes, when the work is done, I write down what I have seen." She did not sing. She simply read, her clear voice filling the silent, dusty courtroom. "The wealth of a town is not in its gold, nor the deeds to the land that are bought and sold. It's a hammer's ring and a harvest stored, and a quiet place at a common board. For the poorest voice has a thing to say, at the closing down of a weary day." She stopped and closed the book. She had not asked for anything. She had not pleaded for their sympathy. She had simply reminded them that a community is built of more than just regulations, that its true wealth lies in the dignity it affords its people. The silence that followed was profound. Finch's face was a mask of disbelief, as if he could not comprehend why she was talking about poetry instead of fire codes. Then, a loud, clear voice came from the back of the room. It was the town blacksmith, a huge man with soot ingrained in the lines of his face, his arms as thick as fence posts. He stood up, a towering, respected figure in the community. "I work with fire every day," the blacksmith said, his voice a deep baritone that rumbled through the room. "I know its dangers, but I also know a thing or two about value." He looked directly at the council, then let his gaze sweep over Finch and Henderson. A life saved weighs more than a rumor, and a place that offers a good meal and a moment of peace to a working man is worth more than any fee you can put on a piece of paper. He sat down, but his words had tipped the scale. A farmer stood up. "My boys stopped there on the way back from the high pasture. They say it feels like coming home." A woman from the church added, "Miss Ward's pies at the Jubilee were the best I've ever tasted." One by one, the quiet voices of the community rose in her defense, not with legal arguments, but with simple, honest testimonials. The council members exchanged glances. They saw the tide had turned. Chairman Miller cleared his throat again. "The council finds that the safety measures, as described by Miss Ward, are satisfactory," he announced. "The commercial license will be granted. In light of its public service, the fee will be set at a modest $10 per year." He banged his gavel on the table. "This matter is closed." The quiet stove would live. That evening, the kitchen was a sanctuary of peace. The meeting felt a world away. Evelyn was cleaning the long wooden table when Graham came in. He didn't speak of the meeting, of her victory. He walked over to where her leather book lay, still open to the page she had read from. He picked up the small pencil she kept tied to it. Beneath the last line of her song, he wrote a single sentence in his strong, clear hand. "The walls are kept warm by the song. The song is kept safe by the walls." He put the pencil down. It was not a proposal. It was not a declaration of love. It was a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of their silent, unbreakable partnership. He had built the walls. She had filled them with a song. Each was essential to the other. There was no need to rush toward a different future. They had chosen to build this one, together, one day at a time, working side by side in the quiet light of each dawn. The town accepted the verdict. The community, having spoken, now acted. The men who had once laughed at the Jubilee began to appear at the quiet stove on Sunday mornings. They brought their wives and their children, all of them dressed in their clean church clothes. They came not just for the food, but to sit in the peaceful room and listen, to make their families a part of this small, sacred piece of their community. One Saturday, Molly appeared at the door. She said nothing. In her hands, she held a large, beautiful bouquet of wild mountain daisies, the same kind that had once been left on Evelyn's step. She walked over to the counter, placed them in a large water pitcher, and then turned and left without a word. It was a quiet, final surrender, an offering of peace. And Finch, the former manager, was seen in town a few days later, his belongings packed in a wagon. His power had been woven from whispers and shadows, from the legal fine print and the dark corners of men's suspicions. When Evelyn had stood in the light, armed with competence and a simple, honest song, his power had dissolved into nothing. He had lost, and he knew it. He slunk away from the valley, his departure as quiet and as final as the closing of a door. There was no need for a final, dramatic scene to mark his end. The life of the quiet stove was just beginning. The seasons turned, and the harshness of autumn softened into the deep, quiet sleep of winter, which in turn gave way to the slow, muddy awakening of spring. The quiet stove became the steady, beating heart of the ranch. Its rhythm was marked not by the clock, but by the rising of the sun, the needs of hungry men, and the gentle melodies that now seemed a permanent part of the building's architecture, as integral as the stone of the hearth or the pine of the walls. One day, as Evelyn was lifting a new 50-pound sack of flour onto the counter, a small, folded piece of paper fluttered out from where it had been tucked between the burlap and the string tie. It was a note, written in the large, looping, uncertain hand of a child. She opened it. "Dear Miss Ward, my name is Anna. My PA works on the Miller farm down the valley. I heard him tell my ma about you and your kitchen. I like to sing when I churn the butter, but my older brothers say it's a useless noise and I should be quiet and work. Pa says a song doesn't put food on the table. Is it useless? Do I need to stop?" The letter was unsigned, but the earnest, painful question at its heart was as clear a signature as any. Evelyn held the small piece of paper in her hand, the flour dust on it a faint, ghostly fingerprint. She saw a small girl in a dim kitchen, her small voice silenced by the hard, practical world of men. She saw herself, not so many years ago, humming alone, believing her own small song was a thing of no consequence. That night, long after the last of the men had gone and the kitchen was hers alone, she sat at the long table by the light of a single lantern. She took out the leather-bound book, which was no longer empty. It was filled now with a dozen songs, the pages marked with notes and smudges of flour and butter. She turned to a fresh, clean page, dipping a pen into a small pot of ink. She did not write a song. She wrote a letter. "My dearest Anna, no song is ever useless. People will tell you that the only things of value are the things you can count, like coins or cattle. But they are wrong. A song cannot be counted, but it can make a heavy task feel lighter. It cannot be eaten, but it can feed a part of you that bread cannot reach. It is a thing you make from nothing but breath and memory, and it is all your own. Do not sing for your father or your brothers. Do not sing to prove it has a use. You must sing to be true to yourself first. Sing because it makes the rhythm of the butter churn a little sweeter. Sing because it puts a secret smile in your own heart. Sing to be honest. After that, you can let the world decide if it wants to listen." She let the ink dry, the words stark and black on the clean page. Then she went to the windowsill, where a fresh bunch of mountain daisies sat in their tin can. She took one perfect purple flower and a single sturdy leaf. She laid them on the page of her letter, folded it carefully around them, and placed it inside a clean envelope. On another small slip of paper, she wrote out her simplest recipe for cornbread, the one that required only buttermilk, cornmeal, and a little molasses. She tucked that in as well, a practical piece of comfort to accompany the advice. She sealed the envelope with a small drop of red wax from a candle, a small, formal seal on a promise sent from one singer to another. The next morning, she gave the letter to the mail rider, a young man who now made a regular stop at the quiet stove for a hot cup of coffee before starting his long route. He tipped his hat, placed the small, precious cargo in his leather pouch, and rode off. Evelyn watched him go, a plume of dust rising behind him, until he was just a speck on the horizon, the red wax seal. Holding her words and a single pressed flower was a tiny lantern being carried out into the wider world. The quiet stove was always full now, but it was never loud. A strange and beautiful quiet had taken hold of the place, the kind of comfortable, breathing silence that people wanted to preserve. Men spoke in lower tones. Their laughter was softer. They lingered over their coffee, their rough hands wrapped around the warm ceramic mugs. Listening. The room was a sanctuary, a respite from the harsh winds and the harder work that waited for them outside. Evelyn moved through it all with a grace born of purpose. She sang as she poured coffee, her voice a low, steady thread that wove through the quiet conversations and the clink of silverware. Graham was always there, a solid, unassuming presence. He worked at her side, their tasks flowing into one another in a seamless, unspoken partnership. As she sang a line about the rising sun, he would wipe down the long table, the rhythm of his arm matching the cadence of her hand as she refilled a cup. They were two parts of a single, well-oiled machine, two notes in a quiet, harmonious chord. One evening, a young cowboy, barely old enough to grow a proper beard, was finishing his stew. He was new to the ranch, his face still holding the open, lonely look of a boy far from home. As Evelyn passed, he looked up, his eyes full of a shy, desperate gratitude. He leaned in, as if sharing a secret. "Ma'am," he whispered, his voice cracking slightly, "this kitchen, it makes a man feel less cold." Evelyn stopped. His words, so simple and so true, went straight to her heart. This was it. This was the purpose of it all. Not the food, not even the songs, but this, the easing of a loneliness she knew so well, the creation of a small pocket of warmth in a wide, cold world. She looked up, her gaze instinctively seeking Graham's across the busy room. He was standing by the hearth, watching her. He had heard the boy's words. Their eyes met, and in that long, silent look, 1,000 unsaid things were finally understood. There was no promise of a future, no demand for a commitment. There was only the profound, unshakable certainty of his presence. He was there. He had been there all along, and he would continue to be there. It was a promise more real and more binding than any vow spoken before a preacher. Later that night, when the last cup was washed and the fire was banked, she took the leather-bound book and placed it on a high shelf above the hearth, between a jar of dried herbs and a tin of coffee. It was a book of beginnings, the first chapter of a story that was still being written. The page for the next song, the song of the next season, was waiting. She looked around the quiet, sleeping room, at the moonlit path the east window laid across the floor, and she finally understood. Her life had been a small, silent room, waiting for someone to hear the music hidden inside it. All it had ever needed was one person, one quiet, patient man, to stop his horse and listen. In doing so, he had not just saved her life from the smoke, he had given her a place to sing, and in that one simple, profound act of hearing, he had taught an entire kitchen how to sing for a lifetime. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and where you are in the world. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you'd really like to support us, please press that hype button to help this story be heard by more people.